to the F.O.C podcast. My name is Kyle McLaughlin, and I am your host for today's episode, which happens to be the second part of a three-part video series that we're doing on the construction process from start to finish. And if you remember the last episode, we talked all about pre-construction. So for pre-construction, we discussed architecture, engineering, and construction documents, all being part of the land entitlement and permitting process. So now moving into step 2, or phase 2, I should really say, which is the actual vertical construction process. We should already have our permit in hand, which has been approved by your local municipality or building jurisdiction. And we are shovel ready. Our lot is ready to go. It's entitled. We have all of our approvals. Everybody's expecting us to build. So let's get to building. So I'm going to break this up into steps and kind of how they all coincide with each other. Now, there's a specific order in this, this needs to happen in. Going right up until framing, and then I'll show you kind of how things can change a little bit depending on the project. Some steps may happen before others. Also, some builders prefer to do things before others after the dry-in process as well, but we'll get into that. But starting with step 1, that's going to be your site prep. So site prep is exactly what it sounds like. Your land is ready to go. If you need to cut down trees, if you need to mow overgrown grass, if you need to clear the lot itself, we would do that in the site prep plot process. Then we would start excavation, meaning if we need to dig any trenches, any openings for the foundation, if we need to bring in fill, all of that site prep and site grading is what they call it, is happening during the excavation process. So you have excavation, you have grading, and then you're doing your trenches if you need on each side, or for underground conduits for all your utilities, such as your MEPs, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then you're getting ready to frame out your footers, right? So depending on the foundation type, which I'll talk about, in this example, you'll have traditional footers, let's just say. You need to frame those out and pour those prior to doing anything else, prior to obviously pouring your slab. So your slab is held up by these footers in this example. Those are framed out, exactly what it sounds like, with plywood, and then the concrete gets poured on top of that. Now, before they do that, they also include rebar. And if you don't know what rebar is, it's a metal structural support system. We also offer it at Northstar. We offer it in a composite version because, as you know, steel is subject to rust, to corrode. So by using the composite rebar, we actually get higher performance, and we don't risk the degradation of the material itself, and we don't risk any rusting or any lack of performance, right? So whether you're using steel or rebar is part of the example. Steel rebar or composite rebar is part of this example. After that's been caged in and that rebar has been set there, then you pour the concrete for your footers. And then after the footers are obviously cured and dried, then you can start bringing in some of your fill, right? So some of the things that will change there, right? And this is how I'm going to start officially moving into step 2. So step 2 is really all about foundation and slab. So depending on the foundation type that you have, let's just say you're in a flood zone and you're at virgin ground is at 3 feet, and you need to be at 8 feet to be compliant with flood elevation guidelines, right? Your non-conforming space needs to be below that. So once you're above that 8 feet, then you can actually start your living area construction, right? So that would be your first living floor, quote unquote. So obviously we have a problem. We're at 3 feet virgin ground, but we need to come up to 8. So what a lot of builders and a lot of construction methods will use is actually incorporate the use of a stem wall. So a stem wall will go on top of your footers, and it'll be basically the buffer between the footers and the slab on top. So once we have our stem wall constructed, right, for lack of a better term, then we'll bring in our fill. Obviously, the roughing has already happened. I was talking earlier about the trenching or the conduits for plumbing and electrical coming in underground. Fill comes in right after that, and then we get to pour our slab on top of all that and let that cure in order to begin our vertical construction and our erection of what we call our structural shell, right? So that's step 2. That was foundation and slab. Now we're moving on to step 3, which is going to be your structural shell and the actual building of the envelope of your building, whether it's a house or a commercial building is relevant, right? They all require a structural shell. Before I move on, I want to make a quick point because we talked a little bit about foundations, and that seems to be kind of where everybody It's a big source of confusion. Let's put it that way, especially in areas like Florida, where you're prone to flooding and you're prone to areas that are going to be coastal based. So the assumption from insurance companies and from FEMA is that at some point you will flood, right? So how high do you need to be up in order to avoid that? So we talked about a stem wall, which raises the grade and the finished grade of your land, right? If you need to go higher than, let's just say 4 or 5 feet, a lot of people opt for a non-conforming first floor. So as one of the options, the non-conforming first floor, think of that as your garage or non-living area square footage. So if you have your footers, your slab, but then your first living area doesn't begin into your second floor, that's technically your first floor living area, that first floor becomes a non-conforming space. You can use it for storage, as a garage, or for anything that doesn't require AC and electrical and plumbing to be down there, right? That's one method of elevating, quote unquote, your living area. What you'll see some other people do too, and it's those of you that have been down to Florida or the Florida Keys or some areas in the Carolinas, you do have what's called stilt construction. And stilts are exactly what it sounds like. Let's picture a Key West style home that's elevated on stilts. And now those stilts are bored into the ground, and they can either be done directly on a slab, or some of them will just have gravel, and they'll bypass the slab and go down into a footer underneath the ground. So imagine pouring the footer and then just creating a stilt off of that and setting them strategically gridded throughout your property, and then setting your home, your foundation on top of that, right? So that's stilt construction. Now, in areas that are very sand-based, let's just say where the ground is not as stable as you would hope, there's actually the introduction of pilings, right? So pilings are these massive piles that are driven deep into the ground, sometimes as deep as 30 feet, depending on soil conditions. And that is used to stabilize the ground in which your structure is sitting on, right? Otherwise, if you didn't have these pilings and you were building a house on a very unstructured soil, right, such as sand, then you would risk the house literally sinking or tipping over, right? So in order to avoid that, builders use what's called pilings, right? So we have regular foundation, slab on grade, monolithic slab. We have stilt construction, and then we have elevated construction, like I said, for the non-conforming first floor. And then another foundation type 2 being pilings. Depending on geographically where you are in the United States, this will vary. You will have some other types of construction and foundations up in the north, up in areas that are mountainous, that you're boring onto limestone or rock or bedrock. I mean, it's completely different at that stage. But for now, we're focused on some of the more traditional foundation types in Florida, right? Okay, so that's it on foundations. Moving on to our structural shell, which I spoke about earlier. That's step 3 in our example right now. Depending on the construction type that you're using for your building, you have up until now, before North Star, you really only had 2 options, right? You had concrete block, which is very popular in Florida, especially in high velocity hurricane zones. And then in other areas of the country, you'll have wood frame construction, right? And that's for the envelope of your building. And then trusses on top are mostly wood. That's pretty standard throughout. The residential construction industry, you'll see metal roofs and metal trusses more so on commercial, but sometimes residential as well. So that was really your only options before North Star came along. And that's a lot of the things that I talk about when we talk about advancing the future of construction, right? Is introducing this new building system that is proprietary to North Star. And that's the use of our composite materials, our exo shell wall and our exo frame and our exo structure. And I'll talk about what all that means to create a building envelope, the structural shell, made out fully of composite materials, right? So in a wood frame assembly, you have your 2x4 studs, and you have your 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch plywood as the sheeting. On CBS or concrete block construction, you have each individual cinder block that makes up the structure of the home, and then you bring them together with tie beams, right, to provide the structural integrity on top. With us, it's somewhat similar to wood frame construction as far as how it's assembled. So we have our C channels, which are 6 inches that act in lieu of a stud, right? That's our version of a stud. And then our 1/4 inch ballistic panel, that's the sheathing on the outside part of the wall. So that's your exterior wall. And then that cavity that's left within is where all of our MEPs and our installation goes into. And that's basically our exoshell wall in a summary version, right? And then from there, we have structural components that we add to build up a whole entire load-bearing structure. Our walls can be either non-load bearing or load bearing. On the load bearing side, we actually incorporate the use of more studs and more structural elements such as tubes in order to support either a second story or obviously the roof on top of that, right? And I want to talk about that a little bit. So normally when you have a one-story home, that's where the story ends, right? Then your roof goes on top of that, your trusses go on top of that, the sheeting for the roof goes on top of that, and that's it. You have your structure. Now, if you have a two-story home or more, right, you're going to have floor assemblies in between each floor, and then finally the roof on top. So you have a couple options with floor assemblies. A traditional one that I've seen, depending again on location, budget, construction type, a lot of people just make them out of wood, right? So you'll have wood flat floor trusses, and then you'll have some sort of sheeting on top of that, normally plywood, and that makes up your floor assembly. And then you put your walls up on top of that, and then your roof goes on top of that second floor or third floor, vice versa. We have two options as far as it comes to North Star Construction. We have our composite decking, which is very similar to wood, again, from an assembly standpoint, not from a material standpoint, where we use rim track and joists, and we use floor trusses in order to build up the structure of that second floor. And then on top of that, our sheeting is called DuraShield, which is about an inch thick hollow core material that sheathes its tongue and groove, and it sheets right on top of that, creating your floor structure, floor assembly, right? Another option that we have is composite concrete decking. If you guys are familiar with Epicor or hollow core, then you'll be familiar with what I'm talking about here, where we actually create a whole deck made on a 2 to 3 inch concrete topping pour on top of a composite tray that's held up by either our walls or block in whatever scenario you're building your home with as far as the construction materials go. So we can do a composite deck with the rim track and joist system that I mentioned, or we can do it with a concrete pad such as Epicor or hollow core or any other floor assemblies for that matter. But our preference would either be our composite decking or the concrete composite as well. So that is a nutshell of how things can change on a floor-to-floor basis. Now, the roof happens the same way. We do make our roof trusses out of composite materials, but for the sake of the example, a traditional home is built with wood trusses, with wood sheeting. Again, a North Star home can be, both of those elements can be composite as well. That goes on top of your walls or your concrete block structure. They use hurricane tie downs or straps in order to stop those from flying away, right, during high velocity hurricane zone circumstances. But again, that's more of a native to coastal areas such as Florida or anywhere else that's exposed to hurricane velocity winds such as the Carolinas and Louisiana, Mississippi, those areas, right? And after that, you put your sheeting on top of your roof, and you basically have your structural shell. That's your structure there, right? I'm gonna pause there for a second. Take a sip of my water because we are talking about a lot of good stuff today. Again, welcome to the F.O.C podcast. I'm your host, Kyle McLaughlin. I appreciate you joining us today on the construction process, right? So we're talking all about construction. Last time we talked about pre-construction. Now we're talking about that vertical construction phase and all the different steps that go into it. I'm taking a sip of my water, and we will continue on to step number 4. So that would be your dry-in phase, right? And maybe you've heard some builders, some contractors talk about what dry-in actually means. It's basically what it sounds like. You're creating that structure and you're making it so water or other elements from Mother Nature can't get in, right? So normally when you're drying in a house, there's 3 major elements to that. You have obviously your windows and doors that need to be installed and sealed properly and waterproof properly. You have your garage door, if you have one, or any other rough openings that need to be enclosed. And then also, of course, you have your roof. So putting sheeting on it isn't enough to waterproof it. Normally you're using some sort of membrane and some sort of ice and water barrier or any sort of dry-in barrier that you would use on top of that sheeting, right? And I'm just looking at my notes here because I have so many different notes. Yeah, you're going to have your water barrier, your exterior waterproofing, and then any sort of other dry-in elements that you need for both the structure itself, depending on the construction type. So as I mentioned before, if you're using traditional materials such as wood or concrete, You will use some sort of waterproofing on the outside, as both of those are porous materials that will soak up water, right? So mostly with wood, you use, if you've seen those house wraps with Tyvek, that would be normally an indicator that that's a wood structure. If you've seen concrete block, normally there's some sort of water barrier or waterproofing that they use either through a primer, or even paint sometimes can be a waterproofer. And you'll see that more normally in that type of construction before the stucco or whatever exterior finish goes on top of that, right? Which also needs to be painted in itself. Now for the exoshell wall assembly, right? Our ballistic panel is non-porous, meaning that it doesn't absorb water. So it is almost it basically is a finished wall. Obviously, you're going to want to decorate it or paint it or put some hardy board or any sort of veneer, brick, or even stucco on it. And we have our own version of stucco, which we call stucco flex, that we like to use. That's more of an elastomeric based stucco that's pre-painted and doesn't crack like normal stucco does, and it doesn't wear over the course of time, especially once again in coastal areas that are exposed to less rain and less sea salt water and things of that nature, right? So again, recap, if you want to dry in the house, depending on the construction type, it's going to take a couple different steps. If you're going with a North Star home and a North Star wall and a North Star structure, then you get to skip over some of those steps and go straight into stucco. But nonetheless, still need your windows and doors, still need your garage door, and you still need to have your roof dried in. Okay? And that is it for the dry-in, which was step number 4. Now, moving on to step number 5, you'll have your interior framing, right? So now that everything is dried in, that we don't have to risk it raining and things getting wet on the inside, we can begin some of the work on the inside of the house, right? So first and foremost will be interior framing. You have a couple options here as well. As you did on the exterior, you can either do light gauge metal for your interior non-load bearing walls, where you're going to put your drywall up that separates, your kitchen from your living room, from your bedroom, from your bathroom, right? All that's normal framing that you see in construction sites. Or you can do that out of wood as well. Now that's going to be based on personal preference. A lot of the kind of the going thought in the industry is that if you're using wood for your interior framing, you're going to reduce the sound transfer within the house, right? Metal is obviously thinner, especially light gauge metal that's used for framing. So you will have a little bit more of an acoustical challenge there than you would with wood because it's a thicker material, right? And you will avoid some rattling in the event that the structure shakes. Think of like an example as like if you're in an earthquake prone area, but even like during a heavy thunderstorm, right? When thunder hits nearby or lightning strikes nearby and you hear the thunderclap, that sometimes can rattle a home depending on how close you are to it. So you may actually hear some of the walls rattle, believe it or not. But it doesn't always happen. Obviously, depends on the quality of the construction for your specific house or building structure. But nonetheless, you have those two options. We do also offer at North Star composite non-load bearing framing for the interior, which will once again replace the light gauge metal studs or wood studs as well. So once you have basically think if you're looking at overhead at your floor plan, once you have your floor plan, quote unquote, framed out, all your rooms, things are starting to take shape now. Things are getting exciting. You have a little bit of a better idea of what your sense of space is going to be. So you have the difference between each bedroom, each bathroom, each major living area, a kitchen, a garage, an attic, a bonus room, a game room, what have you. So now you're kind of starting to see what this floor plan, this layout is going to look like. Now you can move on to step number 6, which is going to be your NEPs. So remember earlier when we talked about during the foundation and slab process how you had to rough in your pipes for sewage and your pipes for water and some of your underground electrical components. That's where that comes in handy now, because as you'll have access to those rough-in points, you can begin the rest of your NEP construction from the inside. Normally, what we like to do first is work on our HVAC systems, our air conditioning. Whether you're doing a traditional one or mini splits, you're still going to have some duct work that needs to go in between, the truss cavities, needs to go in between the wall cavities, if that's applicable for your construction. That needs to obviously spider from each room back to the main, what we call an air handler. Up north, we may call it a furnace. So once that's installed, then all the ductwork will vent out of that or spider out of that into each specific room in which you need airflow, right? And that could be a bathroom, it could be a closet, it could be obviously your main living areas or kitchen, and any other areas that you have in your home that you require it to be under air, right? That's where that term comes from. So once all that ductwork is done and we have some basic venting going on that's attached either to the floor assembly, some people vent from the floor, or the roof assembly. Some people, obviously, most construction, especially down here in Florida, is vented from the roof. Then you're basically ready, at least from our perspective and how we like to do our order operations. We move on to our electrical wiring, right? So that's going to be all your access points for both your plugs and also your light switches and all the electrical current that's carried through those. Also for your major appliances, such as that air handler / furnace that I was talking about earlier. And then also some of your major kitchen appliances that are going to need power, right? A little bit of a caveat to that is if your home is powered by gas or any other alternative energy source, then obviously you would replace or include gas lines or any other sort of power line that you happen to be using. But the standard that most people use, electric, they do use some gas components specifically for cooking and maybe for heating up a pool, things of that nature, or even a fireplace would happen with gas as well, but can also happen with electrical, right? So we have our major mechanical, so MEPs stands for mechanical, electrical, plumbing. We've done our mechanical, which is our AC. We've done our electrical, which is all the electrical wiring that I just spoke about. And then we move on to plumbing, right? So you have your inbound plumbing and your outbound plumbing. Inbound is the water coming in. Outbound is obviously all the waste going out and the used water going out. In between that, we also have hot and cold water lines. We use a material called PEX, which we found to be the industry leader in materials for hot and cold water movements, right? So we'll do all of our plumbing and all the PEX will run through the house as well for all areas, obviously, that require water and drainage. So that could be, again, your kitchen, your bathroom, any outdoor kitchen you may have. If you have a pool as well, obviously that's going to have its own set of mechanical and plumbing and electrical components that are running in and out of it. And that could be a whole different training, different podcast that I'll do at a certain time, just specific to pools and other auxiliary items that are in your house that are being ran off with their own MEPs, right? And that is basically step 6. So we have, again, all the MEP work that we did, all the venting work that we did, all the duct work that we did. And now we get to move on to step 7, which is our exterior and interior trim work, okay? Before I move on, I want to pause there for a sec because it's important that you know that you'll have a couple different inspections happening during your construction process, right? And once again, depending on the material that you're using, you may have 5 inspections, you may have 10. It, again, depends on the material. But some of the inspections that you'll have regardless of your building material are going to be your rough-in inspection, your framing inspection, and your rough-in inspection, your framing inspection, a structural inspection, and obviously a dry-in inspection as well. Those are always, no matter what, you'll be subject to those inspections. So make sure that you're communicating with your jurisdiction or with your GC, with your building authority, or if you're using a private provider, communicating with their inspectors as well to make sure that those inspections are scheduled on a timely manner and it matches up with when your construction crew is actually finishing their scope of work, whatever it may be on site. Very, very, very important. Okay, without further delay, moving on to step 7. We're a little bit more than halfway in the construction building process here at the F.O.C. podcast. Again, I'm your host, Kyle McLaughlin, and we are powering through these different steps. Moving on to exterior and interior trim, you're going to obviously have some of your exterior finishes, depending on the design intent or the architectural intent. This will vary. Some of the standard finishes are going to be stucco or stucco flex, which I mentioned earlier. Brick, for those of you that are up north, or some other areas here that the architectural intent is more colonial or cottagey. Veneer, hardy board, which is the planking or the siding that you see on some of the more coastal-based homes, or just regular stucco and paint on top of that, right? It just depends on what your design intent was for the house or for the building that you were building, right? Commercial, you'll see, tilt wall construction, you'll see metal finishes, you'll see all sorts of different things that we're not really going to get into in this specific episode, but be aware that in commercial, you will have some different exterior finishing options as well to be aware of, okay? After that,
we have our roof finish as well, right? So we did the dry-in earlier in the steps of this episode. We have the membrane underneath, and then if you're going in with, let's just say, shingle, right, or tile or a metal roof, that's basically the finished part of your roof, depending on what your selection was there. I'm a big fan of a flat slate tile from a design look and feel. I like the look of that. I also really like standing seam metal roofs. Standing seam are the one that basically they're your traditional Florida style metal roofs in which you can't see any of the seams of the bolts, which is why they call it standing seam. And then if you prefer to just have regular asphalt or composite shingles, obviously that's an option as well. Okay. Now, moving into the interior, you've done all your exterior work. Your house is really coming together on the interior. And then keep in mind, some of these things will happen in different orders, depending on your builder, depending on your location, depending on your architectural style. Some of these things are happening not in this same order after, as we moved on to step 7 and beyond. Okay. On the inside, pretty obvious, right? What happens on the inside? We have our sheetrock that needs to be hung, aka drywall, right? So that is hung, then it's taped, then it's mudded, and then obviously you sand it or texture it depending on the design intent that you're going for the interior. Almost forgot, before you hang your drywall, you are going to need your insulation, right? You got a couple different options there too to insulate your house. Does two things. It helps with your energy efficiency first and foremost. It also, depending on the material you're using for your insulation, can be a fire suppressant, right? Or any sort of fire rating will be associated with that, which is always helpful. And then you have your option to either do blow-in insulation, which is usually the fiberglass that's getting blown into your roof, your attic cavity. You obviously have batted insulation, so like a mineral wool. We use Owens Corning Thermofiber. Their performance is incredible, and we use that in most of our homes, unless you're doing something like a spray-on icing, which is going to be your most expensive option. Normally, that's only done in between floor-to-floor assemblies, or also in the roof as well, as we mentioned earlier. But I've seen people also doing the walls if that's what they want. If they want a very energy-efficient home, they can do that as well, right? So we have the insulation. Once the insulation is all packed in or blown in or sprayed in, then we can hang our drywall, right? And then go back to the process I was talking about earlier, which is mudding, taping, and sanding and finishing that texture, okay? Now the house is really coming together. Now that you can't see in between the studs anymore, now you get a really good sense of dimension. You get a good sense of space. You get a good sense of like how much furniture you can bring in or how big it can be. So this is really where your house is starting to come to life, right? And now we move to step number 8, which is your finishes. And we're almost done here. We're on the home stretch of your home or your commercial structure or what have you being built, right? So on your finishes, obviously you're going to have your floor. And of course, there's endless amount of options there. Popular ones are tile, wood, carpet, LVT. Can't go wrong. I'm a big fan of tile, especially the tile that looks like wood. They make them in those big planks. I think those are super cool. Obviously, once your floor is in, then you have some of your cabinets that are already either being hung for your uppers or being installed on the floor for your lowers. On top of the cabinets will go your countertops. If you're creating a vanity in your bathroom, whether it's custom made or you bought one from Home Depot or your builders provided one, those vanities are being installed. You're having your light fixtures installed as well for either recessed lighting, can lighting, or any light fixtures that are going in your bathroom or your kitchen or any other areas that need to be lit, right? And then your plumbing fixtures as well for all of your running water in your sinks or in any of your outdoor kitchens or anything like that, right? So at this point, the house is pretty much done. You got your paint that you're doing, hopefully before some of those steps that I just mentioned, right? Usually, you'll do a coat of prime, you'll hang your cabinets, and then you'll finish painting off the rest of the house to avoid getting things dirty. You'll see, your good builders will lay down some sort of floor protection or paper or visqueen or something to avoid dust or paint getting onto cabinetry or even countertops for that matter, right? So again, recap, you got your cabinets, you got your flooring, you got your countertops, you got your paint, you have your lighting fixtures and your plumbing fixtures. And at this point, guys, the house is pretty much moving ready, right? We've still got a couple more steps before we can turn that key, but we are almost there. Moving on to step number 9. And again, the order doesn't have to be specifically this one, but this is normally how we do. We have our driveway, we have our pavers, we have our sidewalks that are being installed. If you're doing a poured driveway, poured concrete, obviously that's a different installation than pavers, different costs, different options, but that's happening nonetheless. Then you're having your landscaping come in, your sod, your mulch, your shrubbery, depending on what your selections were. Everything's really coming together. Your backyard. If you install the pool, you're doing the pool decking. You're doing that, whether it's poured or pavers as well. And then any landscaping in the rear of the house, the backyard as well. That's your driveway and landscaping step. And then as we move on here to the final countdown, we have step number 10, which is your certificate of occupancy and your final inspection, right? So we are done for the most part, right? We just are pending the last final inspection by your building authority or private provider that can say, okay, you're good to go. Here is your certificate of occupancy, quote unquote, your CO, and you're good to move into your home, right? There is a final inspection associated with that. There might be some punch list items that the inspector requires you to complete before issuing you that CO. But at this point, you're done, right? And that was basically the entire construction process in about 30 minutes. Fit up a lot of information. Obviously, I don't expect you to remember a lot of that. So what we will do is we will provide a handy dandy downloadable spreadsheet and downloadable PDF that you will have access to, whether you're watching this on YouTube, you're listening to this on our podcast channels, you will have access to download that as a link so you can see the process step by step. And I'll include much more detail than I have time to talk about during this episode. And as always, our lines are open. Our emails are open. If you want to visit our website, northstartgi.com or northstarhomes.us, you can fill out a contact us form and ask a question, guys. We love what we do. We love construction. We love talking about it. We love educating the general public, which I think is something that's severely lacking in the industry. It has come a long way now that through the use of technology channels such as this one and YouTube and podcasts, which we can provide some education, but nothing's better than just calling somebody up or emailing them and getting some direct answers to some very specific questions. As I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, every construction type method building is completely unique and different. Even if you're creating the floor plan over and over and over and over again, it's the same one, it doesn't matter because each lot is very unique and it's all going to come with its own set of things that you need to do in order to build on top of it, or challenges or things that you need to be aware of. So please don't be shy. Don't hesitate to reach out to us directly and some of those contact methods that I provided earlier to make sure that you are very, very educated on the construction process, right? So again, now that you have your CO, you think you're done, you think you're ready to move in, but honestly, there is one more step that I really, really want to go over with you guys, which will be the next episode of our F.O.C. podcast series for the whole construction step 1 to final step. We talked about pre-construction. Today, we talked about the actual construction process. Pre-construction was a previous episode. If you want to go back and see the previous episode, we talk all about design, architecture, engineering. In this episode, we talked about construction. The next episode, we'll talk about some of these checklist items for punch out before you fully have the house turned over to you from your builder. There are some checklist items that I think you'll find of great value, which we'll be providing for free. Basically, some what to knows before the turnover process and you take full legal possession of your property. So I look forward to seeing you on that episode. Again, this is Kyle McLaughlin. This is the F.O.C. podcast. Thank you, guys.